The obvious question about all of this, and you did refer a lot to the Brenthurst report. If I add the numbers up there, then the socialists have a comfortable majority, according to the numbers that are coming out. Should they transpire, should your plea for people to see this as the binary election, which the investment community certainly does, would that not put pressures onto the defragmentation, or potential defragmentation of South Africa? And I'm saying this because at this conference, we are going to examine the whole idea of Cape independence in quite a bit of detail.
Well, I think there's a number of things. Obviously, what's going to come down to is turnout in this next election. And I think that's what's going to be important. I mean, who's able to turn out their voters and to have a differential turnout within the election. That's going to be a very, very important factor. But I do think that the prospect of an ANC, EFF, MK coalition should be enough to get anybody who cares about democracy to the polls. And we're hoping that's going to be a major driver of people to the election. But if the socialists do get in, I think there is really real problems ahead for the country. I would hate to be the finance minister in that new government and have to go and try and raise capital on foreign markets, who look at the radical socialists sitting next to you on your government benches and rightly ask, but, what are the safeguards of investments in your country? So I think that what will have to happen after the election, if we are not able to succeed in getting the multi-party charter over the line, is have to sit back as the multi-party charter to reconvene and decide what we're going to do about how we prevent the doomsday scenario from taking place. I also think there are some dynamics that we're seeing playing out in Gauteng. And I think it's going to come down to who has control of the ANC. Because we've seen a very uncomfortable relationship between the ANC and EFF in places like Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni. And there's definitely two strains within the ANC. One that sees the EFF as a partner, and that's largely the old RET factions around Zuma, and others who don't want anything to do with them because they know that if there is going to be a coming together, it'll be a reverse takeover of the ANC. So I think there's a lot of cards that still need to be played before the election, before we see what the full picture is.
There's so many dynamics. Sitting where you are, given the unhappiness between the current leadership of the ANC and Zuma, for instance, and I'm very pleased that you kicked off with the whole game changer of Jacob Zuma coming back into politics and the MK. Is there a scenario where those three socialist parties actually don't get together and perhaps even work with you?
Well, it would be very difficult to work with socialists because it would make life incredibly difficult to be able to adopt turnaround strategies and the radical reform agenda that you're going to have to drive to get the country working again. We can't continue down the path of more failed socialist policies because we're going to end up with the same brick wall that we've hit with the ANC. I think that it's going to depend on what their demands are. I can't see an MK party tying up with an ANC with Cyril Ramaphosa at its head. And I think one of their demands will be Ramaphosa must go. I think that there will be concessions that are required from a party like the EFF. The type of portfolios they would want, mining, energy, labor, those key portfolios, perhaps even finance, to be able to drive their own agenda. And so I think there's going to be a lot of looking at what the cards are that are dealt by the electorate on the 29th of May and looking at what the best play for the parties will be in that scenario. I still maintain that we can get the multi-party charter over the line. I know that there's a lot of skeptics and say, 2029. I disagree. I don't think there's going to be much left in 2029. And if the socialists do get in the format that you've spoken about, I'm not sure we'll have an election in 2029. And I don't say that to be dramatic. It's the experience that we've seen in other parts of the world where these type of forces get into office. So I think that there's a lot of cards that still have to be played to see. I don't know what MK's policies are. They haven't published a manifesto. They haven't issued what their policies are. I can imagine what they are, and I imagine it follows pretty much down the line of the RET that Zuma was championing before he was removed by the ANC. But it's very difficult. I know what the EFF stand for. They've said very clearly what their 7 pillars are. So it would remain to be seen. But the exciting thing is that the environment is in flux. It's in play. Every other election in the last 30 years, we've all known that the ANC was going to win. It was just by how much. In this election, all bets are off, and there's everything to play for. And that's why the MPC's got to play like our lives depend on it, which they literally do.
We're going to have our first business conference in London on the 15th of May. So within 2 weeks of the election. And there's a huge community there that is really interested from a financial perspective. What would your message, if you were with us in London, what would your message to them be on this binary outcome for the election? Clearly, it is binary. MPC in, markets are going to go nuts. Money will flood into South Africa. MPC not in, another situation. So what do you say to the foreign contingent?
Well, I would say to what they're probably already saying now is that this is a crossroads election for the country. I think local and international investors are viewing this election as last chance saloon for South Africa. Either we're going to get off this low growth, high debt, high unemployment trajectory and onto a new trajectory of hope, opportunity, and prosperity, or we're going to continue to just muddle along down the path towards a failed state. And what will determine that is there could be a number of accelerants to the failed state, an EFF, ANC, MKP tie-up that would accelerate to a failed state. If the ANC gets in with 49% and good, the PA and Al Jamar propping them up to go over the line, you're going to see no incentive to really change policy. So you end up with a slightly slower burn towards the failed state, but it will inevitably happen. We need, as I think one of the former leaders of our party said, what South Africa needs now is chemotherapy, not aromatherapy. And we need to get in there and drive a reform agenda, because if you don't get in and drive these reforms and actually turn them into legislation and turn it into regulations, which the president hasn't done, that's the biggest failure of the New Dawn, is that none of the grand ideas and principles of the New Dawn were ever translated into legislation, to the point where you can't point to a single piece of legislation that the president can put his finger on and say, that's my signature New Dawn piece of legislation. And if you don't get those things right and do the chemotherapy that South Africa is going to need, you're not going to address the root cause of the problem.
Okay, so give me some hope. I said right at the outset that this is a conference to try and look ahead. Yeah. France Grenier, for instance, says if the whole thing falls apart, and we'll hear from France tomorrow, I think, then it's going to accelerate South Africa coming out of the dip that it's going into. But give us some hope from your perspective. When you lie on your knees at night talking to God and asking God, please help, what are you asking Him to help us with?
Well, I spend a lot of my time on the knees in this country, I can tell you that. But I've never been more hopeful about the future of South Africa, because finally there's an opportunity to break the logjam in our politics. Our politics have been so staid and static for the last 30 years. You've had a dominant ANC. You've had a majority party. Here you're starting to see a bleeding away into coalitions. All proportional representation systems around the world end up in a coalition environment eventually. I think you're going to see some new entrants into the market. I think that the choice before South Africans has never been more clear than it is in this election. And here's the other thing. If I look at the registration figures, 1 million new registrations, that's the biggest number of new registrations, I think, since 1994. That shows that people are energized and activated to come and vote. And that excites me. What excites me is the fact that if just, a small percentage of people who didn't vote in the last election come out and vote for the MPC, we can get it over the line. It is in this falling apart that you can start to see the way forward coming together. And I'm really hopeful as well, because for the first time in 30 years, the opposition is not busy scratching its eyes out and, fighting each other, that we're actually in the MPC, sitting around a table, meeting regularly, working together to try and find a solution. Now, we don't agree on everything, and we don't, all, march to the same drum, and that's fine. But on the big things that are facing South Africa, there is almost unanimity, which is why the MPC is releasing now these policies, these joint policies on how we fix load shedding, how we fix policing. I think that should give South Africans hope that we can change the future, but it's going to come down to people coming out to vote.
Is there anything we can pick up from this seismic change in politics globally that can be applied to South Africa and to this next election? And what I mean by that, Obama was never supposed to win. He was never supposed to beat Hillary Clinton. And yet he did by having a different approach to things. Is there something in there that we're all missing?
Yes, Twitter's not the voters' role. Because if Twitter was the voters' role, Hillary would be in the White House, Donald Trump would never have won election, Brexit would never have happened, the Labour Party would be in government. That's the one thing. The second thing to say is that I take great heart around what's recently happened in Poland a couple of months ago, where Donald Tusk formed a pre-election pact with like-minded opposition parties against a very dominant governing PIS party. And the pre-election pact, much like the multi-party charter, was able to unseat the PIS party, break their majority, and is now forming a opposition-led government. And that gives me hope that people can see that the way to change things is through the ballot box. And that's the thing that frustrates me about people who say, I'm not interested in politics. Don't talk to me about politics. Every single thing in your life, from the water in your taps or not, to the electricity in your home or not, to whether you've got a job or not, all comes back to political decisions. And I think it has clicked now that load shedding has reached into people's homes and businesses and flicked the switch down, that people's water and the like has been cut off, that people are realizing now that politics does affect my life and how I vote is going to determine how I live. And I think that makes the binary that much easier to set before the people of South Africa and say, these are now the choices you have. We can continue down this road and it's going to lead to more unemployment, more suffering, more deprivation, or we can strike out on a different path of hope, opportunity, prosperity through bringing the best of South Africa from different parties together around a table to come up with solutions. You're never going to fix what's wrong with South Africa by keeping the same people who are responsible for the bad decisions, the bad policies around that table.
John, if we look just to the north of us, what's happened in Zambia, what's happened in Malawi, where it was impossible odds, a little bit like the situation that some people would say you faced. And yet Hichilema was elected by a population who supposedly were not really interested. Have we got there in South Africa? Have you got any feeling, any indications that what we're seeing from the pollsters, which we mustn't forget is really just a tiny percentage poll, is not actually what people are believing and doing and thinking and feeling on the ground?
Yeah. Well, look, I would say this about polls is that you're right. It's a snapshot in time and things can change. But what you look for in polls is the trend. And I think every single poll, wherever it comes from, has the trend of the ANC on the decline and the opposition on the up. And I think that's important. It's an important point to make. But I think Hichilema is a great example that it can actually be done. And one of the game changers in Zambia was the fact that there was a large contingent of overseas observers in the country, foreign observer missions, who also realized this was a crucial election for Zambia, also on a pathway. Do we continue down the authoritarian path of Lunga, or do we switch to Hichilema? And that's why there was a lot of international interest there. And I think that what made HH's position so much stronger was that the international observer agencies were able to very quickly come out and say, this guy's won the election. Before Lunga could go and do whatever he needed to do behind the scenes to rig the result, it was the same with Ruto in Kenya, where I went to observe the election there as well. And that's why I don't understand the sort of hysteria that's developed about why we are calling in this election for large delegations of overseas observers, because this election, there's everything to pay for, and you've got a governing party that is literally on the ropes and ready to do whatever it takes to stay elected. The more eyes we have on this election, and I think specifically after the IECs stumbling over their first hurdle this last week with the leaking internally of what should be confidential party lists, which is clearly a result of a factional battle of deployed cadres in the IEC who are now drawn between the MK and ANC faction within the IEC, I think it makes it even more important that we have as many eyes as possible on this thing. Because, as I said, in Zambia and Kenya, that was the game changer. It was a lot harder for the incumbents to be able to swing the election when there were so many eyes and ears on the ground.